My name's Dave Thompson, and I'm the Farm Labor Project Coordinator with the National Farmers Union Ontario. This panel and webinar is organized by the NFU Migrant Workers Subcommittee. They have honored me with being your MC today. It's my privilege to share the next hour and a half with you. The National Farmers Union is a membership-based national organization for the collective voice of Canadian farmers working together to fight for agroecology and food sovereignty. Farmers are our farm members. All the rest of Canadians, the 98% who care deeply about our food system but don't farm, we invite to join as associate members. Your membership is important to the NFU, and we'll hope you join us. We would like to celebrate our sponsors who made this workshop possible and have supported and worked with the NFU for many years. Thank you for sharing our vision and for supporting the work we do. We would like to highlight the upcoming workshops in November, culminating in our dynamic national convention, which is truly democracy in action. We hope you'll join us for that as well. The Youth and Women's Caucus meetings are open to all. The Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Working Group is currently seeking to work solely with BIPOC farmers and eaters. We invite you to sign up. We will be offering live interpretation into French for all of the workshops, so please invite your French-speaking colleagues and friends. We'd really like to highlight the keynote speaker, Seth Klein, speaking on A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth is a great speaker. He's also a great writer. And the topic is nothing less than critical. He is speaking at 3 p.m. Pacific time, Thursday, November 26th. Please correct for your local time zone and join us to learn how we can mobilize to address climate change. When the webinar is done, you will receive an email requesting your feedback. Please take a second to fill in the feedback survey so we can continue to improve. I'd like to acknowledge that our participants and audience are joining us from across Turtle Island, the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. I'd encourage you to include what Indigenous lands you are joining us from in this chat. I'm zooming in from the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, a land-based colonially known as Ottawa, Ontario. The NFU recognizes that Canada is a settler colonial country and that Indigenous and non-Indigenous farmers share common ground as people who are on the land and who feed our communities. We promote and support Indigenous land rights and Indigenous food sovereignty. We also acknowledge that many of the migrant workers who come to labor on Turtle Island do so because they have themselves been displaced from their Indigenous lands. If this webinar inspires you to become more involved in seeking justice for migrant workers, there are several ways you can take action. Check out the websites and social media pages on the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change and Justicia for Migrant Workers to keep abreast of the latest action and campaigns.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us here today. Thanks for being here. I'm gonna just share my screen here. Just give me a second to get this organized. There we go. Okay, so long as that, yeah, it looks like everybody can see. Okay, I really welcome the opportunity to be able to be here and chat with everyone. This is a really special, the NFU space is a really special space to be able to talk about food justice and what a sustainable food system means. And where a place where the intersection of migrant worker struggles and food justice struggles really meet in a very important, crucial way. So I want to start out just briefly talking a little bit about Migrant Workers Alliance for Change and what we're doing and some of the work that we are a part of with the Migrant Rights Network. But I'm going to delve deeper into the question of what does a just food system look like, and what is the way that we are trying to build a just food system through building the power of migrant farm workers to organize for dignity and justice. And then talk about how the organizing and the work that the NFU and its membership is doing can actually help build that and build that power building work that we are doing with workers. So I'll just quickly first, there we go, okay. So Migrant Workers Alliance for Change is a member of and is the secretariat of the Migrant Rights Network, which is the country's largest migrant justice network. It brings together migrant-led and migrant-supporting groups from BC right through to Nova Scotia. The Migrant Rights Network has a food and farm worker working group that brings together groups in several provinces to mutually support each other's work and develop collective responses to issues affecting migrant farm workers. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the work we're doing right now through that group a little bit later on in my talk. But the crucial thing is, in the spring of this year, after months of deliberation with our membership and with our migrant base, so we're talking about thousands of migrants and organizations that are led by and support migrants, the Migrant Rights Network finally launched a Status for All campaign. Many member organizations have been pushing this demand for years, but felt that it was crucial that we speak louder and with a united voice to demand immediate and sweeping change on an issue that the COVID reality really only made more crystal clear. And that was that immigration status produces profound inequalities that are deadly, and full immigration status for all is fundamental in creating a more equal, healthy, safe, and just society. The call for Status for All has now received the endorsement of over 350 different organizations from sectors from across the country, and thousands of individual signatures. And I want to particularly note the endorsement of the NFU on our Status for All statement and how important that is for building this broad-based movement for migrant justice. So I'll just mention to folks right now, you can go to our website at statusforall.ca, and you will get linked to this petition where you can add your name and ask you to please share it in your networks so that individuals and organizations you're connected with can join the call. So I do want to talk about how we can actually deepen that commitment. So the NFU's endorsement of the Status for All call, how do we deepen that into a more active engagement in supporting the struggle of migrant farm workers? So the federal government says that it can and does protect the interests of employers and workers and consumers when it comes to the food system. And we all know that that's not only untrue, but is impossible. But it's important to think about how we enact solidarity, to ask ourselves whose interests are served by the exploitation of migrant labor, which, Chris, who's not here unfortunately yet, refers to as a system of modern day indentured labor. The federal government's policies serve the interests of big agri-food interests, as I'm sure we all know here, and in the interest of staking and defending Canada's foothold in the export market. So, I'm sure I don't need to give this room any examples, but we know, for example, as COVID hit between March 15th and June 15th, nearly $1 billion went directly to the agri-food businesses under the guise of saving, quote unquote, family owned and operated farms, when even the Ministry of Agriculture recognized that this money was actually going to industry, who was then expected to then in turn support farmers and workers. And that's not a new funding model. That money, in 2017, about 6.1 billion was spent on the agricultural sector, and over 70% of that went to the largest fifth all farms in Canada. So the Canadian government invests public money into agribusiness expansion, not into ensuring decent working conditions or immigration rights for the workers who sustain it. So in the spirit of this vision of a sustainable democratic food system, we believe that decent work, dignity, and respect for those whose labor makes that system function must be at the bedrock of that vision. That means that for farmers who also believe in that vision, migrant workers are part of your constituency. And that means supporting farm worker organizing, and by which I mean supporting the building of worker power must be a core principle in creating a just food system. And that's going to be the sort of theme of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll explain a little bit about how the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change does that, and our model for building worker power. MWAC was founded 12 years ago as a coalition of migrant-led and migrant-supporting organizations in Ontario. That coalition's work continues, but in recent years, MWAC as an organization has also grown, and we now have 6 staff who do direct on-the-ground organizing with migrant farm workers, with current and former migrant student workers, and with migrant care workers. What do I mean by organizing? I mean that what we are doing is we're supporting the self-organization of workers to build their collective power to fight for dignity and liberation. This means we're building a membership of workers who have access to direct support, political education, leadership development. What we're doing is bringing together workers who are interested in taking action to better their conditions and supporting them to become active members, leaders, and organizers. So, oops, oh dear, there we go. This is the model that I'm talking about. So we are doing this, supporting interested workers to come together to become members and leaders and organizers, both in Canada and in their home countries when they go home in the off season, so that workers are organizing other workers and collectively setting the priorities for system change. So how does this model work? Across the country, there are farm workers that can and must be organized. And I want to lay out how this model works so that you can think about how you can support the expansion of this power building model with us. So we have over 1,000 active contacts with migrant farm workers. About 80% of those are in Ontario and the rest are in BC and in the Atlantic. And we communicate with these workers on a weekly basis. When workers connect with us through our English and Spanish language hotlines, we build relationships with them and bring them into the process of further expanding the base of active workers on their own farms. Workers bring in other workers and establish what we call base groups, so essentially worker committees on farms. Base groups choose their representatives who then meet regularly with other representatives from other base groups on other farms. We currently have 15 active base groups that are representing hundreds of workers, and we meet with and talk with them regularly, and there are several more base groups that are in the process of forming. We support these groups to make decisions together, to set collective priorities, to determine collective plans for action, whether that's on their own farms with their own employers, or in taking actions as part of national campaigns to demand change. Through this process, we identify leaders among those workers. Leaders are drawn in deeper into the organizing process, participating in the setting of strategies for organizing more workers and building up new layers of leaders themselves. This is our base, and it is from these workers that we take direction for our public-facing media and advocacy work. So the next few photos are just sort of some examples. In June, out of the work that we were doing with our base, a number of farm worker leaders had said that they actually wanted to speak directly to the Prime Minister and tell them that what workers needed was status now and status for all. And in the course of less than 2 weeks, over 1,000 farm workers left voicemails on the Prime Minister's phone. And then many more sent us WhatsApp audio messages for the Prime Minister, asking the question why Justin Trudeau is not on WhatsApp. And as a follow-up to that, on the excitement of that action of speaking directly to power, workers then decided that they wanted to start a mini campaign of sharing photos of themselves demanding status for all, like some of the photos you see here. Over 150 farm workers shared photos, most of them unmasked, despite being aware of the risks that represented. So this is a bit of a sort of catch-all of that effort. So we take a similar approach to casework. So when there's an individual worker with a concern, we use casework as a tool for building power. We prioritize collective problem solving, connecting workers with each other to find solutions, having worker leaders lead the work. We prioritize cases that advance campaign objectives. Workers whose cases we take on become leaders and organizers, and their cases are an entry point for other workers to get politically involved. So some of you, don't know what just happened. Oops. So most of you will have known that the third migrant worker who died in Canada of COVID-19 was Juan Lopez Chaparro. He worked on Scotland Farm in Norfolk County. That was a farm where we were organizing workers, including Juan, actually. And right after he died, some of you may have heard that of Luis Gabriel Flores, who is a worker on that farm, who's Juan's bunkmate, and had spoken to media previously through us to complain about the working conditions and the housing conditions that led to the outbreak when those workers were in quarantine and Juan was hospitalized. Gabriel was later fired for having spoken out to the media. And we helped him to file a complaint at the Ministry of Labor under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. But we did so with a press conference at the Minister of Immigration's office, in which Gabriel read out a letter he had written to the Minister of Immigration, explaining to him why the buck actually stops with him, because so long as workers have temporary immigration status in this country, their rights under labor and employment standards, health and safety are moot because they can be deported on a moment's notice. And so that workers are denied the power to be able to protect themselves from things like massive outbreaks and from the kinds of reprisals that Gabriel suffered. The prime witness in his case was Amador Alcantara II, who is the nephew of Juan Lopez Chaparro and worked on the same farm, who was similarly sent home by Scotland very early in the season after Juan died and was never brought back to work. This case led to Gabriel actually becoming an active worker leader in our membership. He is an active leader now. He is mobilizing other farm workers. He is engaging in political work with those farm workers, bringing them into the process for why we need to collectively organize for change. And we have been maintaining other workers updated of his case throughout. And so it has served as a galvanizing force. We have seen an increase in workers reaching out to us, feeling motivated and inspired by what Gabriel has done and showing their support. And so it's a politicizing process that allows other workers to get politically involved. With COVID-19, obviously, a number of things changed for us, in terms of farm visits and things like that. But fundamentally, all it did was exacerbate what we already knew, the realities we already know about migrant farm work. We decided in June to release a report called Unheeded Warnings that was just a snapshot of the massive volume of calls that we had been receiving from workers once COVID hit, detailing some of the things that we were hearing. So border closures and delays, concerns about lost income for workers, but not having access to CERB, quarantine guidelines that weren't being enforced, government subsidies to employers that never translated into improvements in workers' living and working conditions, labor intensification to make workers make up for lost productivity, increased employer control on workers' movement, increased surveillance, abuse, racism, and especially anti-Black racism. And of course, as we all know, the inevitable consequence of this brutal migrant farm labor system, which was the massive outbreaks, illness, and hospitalization and deaths that we saw. That report is available on our website. But our organizing over the year meant that there was already an established base of workers that could mobilize this year to fight back against the way COVID particularly hit farms. And we saw a major increase in workers reaching out to us, wanting to take action, fed up with the mistreatment that they experience year after year, and willing to take action to demand fairness and justice. So we have hundreds of workers that are active in our base, fighting not only for themselves, for their coworkers on their farms, but as part of national campaigns for status for all, in solidarity with other workers, including other migrant workers, care workers, and students, and other workers who are also fighting for fairness. So in this picture, you see a group of migrant farm workers who are our members, showing solidarity for the Dominion strike in New Brunswick against Loblaws. So what this means is that we have a system where we are trying to build the power of workers to organize themselves and to engage in political action in their immediate workplace, but also at a much broader level, and building relationships across sectors of workers. So currently with the Food and Farm Worker Group of Migrant Rights Network, we are collecting feedback from workers to inject into the federal government's housing consultation that was recently announced. I'm sure a lot of you know about that. We know that workers' voices are the last to be heard in government processes, and especially when employer voices are at the same table. But we also know that any policy or law or system to truly work for workers, it must be founded on workers' priorities and demands. And to win those, we must build workers' power to do so. So things like the consultation can be used as an organizing tool to build power. Our membership has a vested interest in and is keen to take up space in this process to make their voices heard. And so we are currently in an iterative collective kind of visioning process with our members about the housing that they want, which is radicalizing for them, which is raising expectations about the kinds of things that workers deserve. And so you'll see here a photo of an agenda from a recent meeting where we had with our base group representatives talking about what kind of housing they deserve and what kind of housing they're willing to fight for and what migrant workers deserve. They know that prying open this consultation, no matter the outcome, to insert worker voices is about using this as an opportunity to engage yet more workers in conversation, first with each other about what they dream of and what they deserve, and then to build their collective power to win it and to demand it from government. So I lay that out to say, you know, this is the approach to farm worker organizing, to building farm worker, migrant farm worker power that we think is going to really start to be able to tip the scales, and that we invite those who believe in a different way that the food system can be organized based on dignity and respect and justice to think about how building power, what role you can play in building migrant worker power as an act of solidarity, and as an act of solidarity with migrant farm workers who are, you know, invested in that same vision. I'll leave that there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was very informative, and it's impressive all the work that the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change has been doing. I'm sure there'll be many questions during the discussion period about your important work. We still haven't heard from Chris Ramsaroop, so we're going to move forward with our third speaker. Jenn Pfenning is going to share her thoughts as an ally and employer of migrant farm workers now. Take it away, Jenn.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'll start by saying that I live on Treaty 3 territory and farm here as well. And I'm very grateful to be able to be in this space with all of you today. A lot of people, I start this conversation a lot of times with sharing my journey to the position that I'm in now and the perspective that I have now, with hopes that it will help everyone else to understand. Maybe if you haven't been engaged in this conversation before. In 2005, our farm started hiring farm workers from Jamaica. We had a labor crunch. We were not able to get enough workers to work with us seasonally, and we just had more work than we could do ourselves. So we hired 10 migrant workers, put up a bunkhouse, and that began this process for me. So as is normal, when you start engaging with a group of people, you know, especially on the farm, we had parties, we had meals together, we spent some of our leisure time together as well. And in that time, that first season, I started to learn about their lives and the program as it impacted them. And they started telling me stories of other farms that they had experienced. And I began by thinking that we needed to have better enforcement of the rules, because from my perspective, you know, there were a lot of rules that I had to comply with as a farmer to hire migrant workers. But over the years, I've come to realize that the program is deeply flawed. And there's been a lot of conversation over those years publicly, maybe not enough of it yet, but there has been a lot of it, talking about just what is happening and just what some of these really horrific impacts have been to migrant workers. And that has led me to go from thinking that we need to enforce the rules that we have more effectively, or tweak or change the rules somewhat, to understanding that what we have is a deeply flawed system. And the system doesn't exist only in Canada. It is global. There are people moving from largely the global south to so-called developed nations under various programs, and all of them are experiencing discrimination and a suppression of their rights. And Canadians, for the most part, find that idea abhorrent. Nobody that I speak to wants to believe that in Canada, we actually have a legal system that puts people in this position. And so over the years, a lot of people have just turned away and have not wanted to face it. They either don't believe that it's happening, or they say that the workers can't be that bad off because they wouldn't come back year after year. So I'm here to tell you as an employer that I know, and this breaks my heart, that the men who work on my farm would not come here year after year if they had a viable alternative in their home country. So I want everyone to think about choices for a moment. When we decide what to have for supper, we can decide what food we put on the table. That's a choice, right? Whether you're going to have rice or pasta. Those are two equivalent options, and you can choose which one you want. But it isn't a choice when you look at being in your home country with your family, where you would love to stay, but you're not able to make enough money to send your children to school, to afford proper health care, or you leave your family behind to earn money in another country so that you can afford to send your children to school and ensure that they have medical care if they get sick or injured. Are those two things equivalent? They're not. That's not a choice. So when people think that the workers are choosing to come here year after year because they have it so good, think again, that's not true. That's why I agree, and I've supported the creation of this committee and the fact that the NFU has supported the Status for All campaigns over the years. Another thing that people talk about is that migrant workers are taking our jobs. I have to take a deep breath before I address that one, because I'll tell you, that one really gets me. I thought this spring we would have an easier time finding people. In fact, I had a number of very angry people reach out to me this spring and tell me that I was a terrible person for hiring migrant workers when so many Canadians were out of work. It hasn't been any easier this year to get Canadians to apply for or fill the roles that we need on the farm. I work on the farm full time. My husband works with me on the farm full time. My two sons work on the farm, my nephews, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law. Our whole family derives our income, our living, our work every day is the farm. But there are a lot of people who don't see farm work as a viable career option. And that's a complicated conversation for us in this country. We have spent a lot of time talking about education, and education is vitally important. It makes the world a better place. But getting an education shouldn't mean that we are no longer interested in doing the work that's required to feed ourselves. That's part of the issue and part of why we can't, we don't have enough people. But the other thing is that in Canada, our population is not growing without immigration. And so we need to look at immigration for people who feed all of us. Right now, they aren't able to immigrate. Technically, there are some paths to immigration, but seasonal workers are not able ever. There is no pathway at all. When the title of this session today is how it impacts all of us. We talk about, and Karen talked very well about the suppression of worker rights. When one section of our society is treated badly, it impacts each and every one of us. Better rights for farm workers and migrant workers in any sector means better rights for all of us. When any other worker is treated poorly, it impacts how we're treated. For over 50 years, we've had the temporary foreign worker program, beginning as the seasonal agricultural worker program in Canada. And I'm very much missing the fact that Chris is not on the call and that he wasn't able to share with us yet. But he has a lot more of the historical background in his head and the data at his fingertips.
Jen,
yes, Dave?
Chris has joined us, so I think he'll be
Wonderful.
able to jump on afterwards, okay?
Okay. So I won't get into the history because Chris is far better versed in that than I am. But when you're listening to him talk about it, think about the impact that has had in the evolution of labor on farms and in food generally. As unions came into place in other sectors, and as worker rights have been enshrined in law through various Ministry of Labor and health and safety rules, that's impacted the labor situation for other sectors. And when you look at sectors like construction, where wages are pretty high per hour as compared with farming, the labor sector has had to adapt because of changes and because they have not had access to foreign workers the way that agriculture has. And so we in the agriculture sector have had a labor force for the larger farms. And again, this is largely for produce and greenhouses. Grains haven't had as much because with grains, you're able to use equipment and you don't need as much manual labor. But any type of farming that has a very significant reliance on manual labor has used a lot of migrant work to fill the need. And over the years, that has impacted how we've evolved as a sector. It's impacted the pricing of food, and all of those it's like a pebble thrown in a pond. All of the ripples from that impact each and every one of us working in farming and food today. When we have increases in costs for labor, that forces an increase down the line. And it's one of the things that governments have recognized, that keeping food prices low is good for stability. And even so, there are a lot of people who aren't able to easily afford the healthy diet that we should all be eating. So it's an interesting and difficult, complicated, nuanced conversation about various rights and how they impact each other and how evolution of costs impacts all of us. But if we don't figure out how to completely reform migrant workers' situation, we will all continue to not see the gains that we need to see and the changes we need to see in labor on farms. And I'm going to leave it there because I really am looking forward to everything that Chris has to say and the conversation after.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jen, for providing your powerful perspective. So Chris has been able to join us via phone here, so we're delighted to have him speak to us. Chris is from Justicia and is going to fill us in on some of the history of the migrant worker program, as well as the work that he does as an activist and scholar. Chris.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak from off the cuff. I apologize for joining so late. Had a few situations arise today. And I apologize for missing some of the presentation. And I think right now, as we look at the chaos that's happening in the United States and trying to understand, you know, the current climate of racism and white supremacy in our society. And when I use those words, I'm talking about what is the role of race and what race plays. It's a quite timely conversation for us to start thinking about the role that so-called managed migrations programs, what many of us will call indentured labor, really, in effect, and its relationship to Canada. And the idea of the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, as all of us know, is nothing new. The program started in 1966. If you're looking for references, the books that I'd like you all to look at, and I'm going to speak very slowly, is Vic Saktovich. The last name is Satzewich. He wrote a book. It was based on his thesis in 1990, and it's called Racism and the Incorporation of Foreign Labor from 1945 to, I believe, 1990. And he looked at the transition, this idea about race and racialization of labor. And what he had noticed, I guess, with the arrival of the program, the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program in 1966, is that the way that the Caribbean migrant workers, particularly first starting with Jamaica and then workers afterwards, that there was a difference in their arrival, or quote unquote, the importation of foreign labor into Canada, as opposed to other groups of workers. And the employers, of course, and the Canadian state would always argue that there is a labor shortage that's existed in agriculture. And I think to effect, we all could agree that there's always been a consistent and persistent shortage of labor. Now, the question is it just that people don't want to do the work, or is it because of the absence of legislative protections? And that's a debate that I'm sure we're going to have a little bit later on. So before 1966, from the period of 1947 to 1965, and this all comes out of Vic's book, is that there was intense lobbying both from the countries of the Caribbean as well as the employer organizations wanting for a very similar program to the H-2 program in the United States. And for all of us who don't know, if you don't know, the H-2 is also a managed migration scheme that has brought in workers, particularly from the Caribbean, but also the Bracero program that brought in over 1 million Mexican laborers to work, particularly in Texas, New Mexico, and California. And Canada at that time was like, yeah, we really want this type of, not Canada, but the employers were like, we really, really, really want this labor force to come to Canada. But the Canadian government was opposed to it for several reasons. And throughout the history of our immigration system and the exclusions that exist, we've seen the same type of narrative to try to exclude racialized workers. So number one, and this all comes from Saktovich's book, that it was too cold to import workers from the Caribbean to work in our fields. Number two, we were concerned because, conditions were not the best, and that if they came to Canada, there would be an uprising. They would be engaging in revolts because of the deplorable conditions. Number three, we didn't want to have these workers have access to our what makes us quote unquote Canadians, access to our social safety net, full access to unemployment insurance, education, EI welfare. And also, finally, they were concerned about interracial relations and ensuring that workers would not freely circulate in our society. And why I bring up historically is these same themes. This is nothing new. Throughout this history of arrivals of the African Americans to the prairies, the Japanese laborers, the Chinese, the South Asians, we've used similar narratives, similar ideas of unbelonging to say that they somehow could not fit in to be in Canada. So as good Canadians, we came up to a compromise and said, yes, we'll have the labor, but they would not be here as a permanent force. At the end of their work, they would have to return back home. And this is important for a couple of reasons, that workers were tied, and previous workers, whether it is the Dutch that came after World War II, the Polish, the English who arrived at the turn of the last century, nobody else came with these type of restrictions on mobility. It's only when we started bringing in, or as Cocq talks about, the importation of black labor, that is where we saw these restrictions, the inability to circulate freely. And in 1966, we saw the arrival of workers from Jamaica. 67 was workers from Barbados and Trinidad, I believe. 72 was the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and 74 was Mexico. And today, as I'm sure the other presenters have told you, that the dynamic, the structure of our agricultural system, the premise and the basis is based on racialized labor, which are tied to an employer. And most of you are going to be like, well, what's the problem? It's a win-win situation. We're bringing up people from the global south who, for some reason, need this type of work, and we're going to be like, let's, this is a good situation. But I want to remind you that the idea is based on the idea of unbelonging. The fact that for some reason that the workers must return home at the end of the year. Number two, that they cannot participate freely as equals in our society. There's no engagement in civic or democratic participation. They're simply told and beholden to laws that we developed, and they're subjected to, in which many of us will call it a system of apartheid, where they have no decision-making, no equality. And at the end of the day, because of their tied work permits, they cannot exert their rights in the workplaces. And I think the conversation a lot of times that we as Canadians have is that somehow the migrant workers are destroying our economy, that they just are too afraid to speak up for their rights. They don't know what their rights are. But many of us would contend that that's actually not the case here, that the labor protections that exist because of the absence or the privatization or deregulation of our rights, where there's no proactive inspections, where the power of industry, rather than enhanced protections, basic protections, the right to organize, the right to overtime pay, other aspects that workers in other industries enjoy, agricultural workers in general don't have these, but specifically migrant workers are not going to stand up for their rights because of the absence of protections and the tied work permits. And getting back to, well, what is the role of race? And I think I want to conclude here. So for myself, my family came to the Caribbean as indentured workers, and they came post-slavery from Trinidad. My family migrated to Trinidad, I believe in the 1880s or 1890s. And as many of us are aware, slavery ended in the Caribbean in the 1830s and 1840s. And to ensure that freed slaves could not exert their rights in the workplaces, in the plantations, that they wouldn't try to bear further pressure on the former plantation masters, they brought in Indian workers and Chinese and Portuguese workers to try to divide the working force. And the idea was that the racialized workers were somehow inferior, and that they would use legal structures, employment regimes, and immigration regimes to deny basic protections. And for myself, it's no coincidence whatsoever that the same bodies, my ancestors and the ancestors of people who were slaves are working under very similar conditions here. The legacy of slavery has influenced our employment regimes, working conditions, and the stereotyping of who does what in our society. A good example of this is even on the crops itself. We have some crops which are, example, predominantly tobacco or apples, which are defined as black crops. We'll see workers from the Caribbean who would be the ones working in those conditions. And they're faced a set of different regimes as opposed to, say, people who are working in greenhouses industries. So very much the type of work that's done, who does what on a certain occupation, is all premised on race. So I just want to conclude for us, when we're having these difficult conversations about race, racism, and the way that we view who belongs in what part of our society, why many of us talk about status upon arrival is about ensuring that our immigration laws are not used to suppress workers, that people have equal rights to circulate, to engage democratically, but also for us to understand that this is not the way that our society should be based on, where some people are basically at the mercy of others based on the color of their skin and their country of origin. And my last final point is we have to understand this larger colonial relationship. What is the role of Canadian agriculture, Canadian mining companies overseas? What are we doing to the people of Global South? What are we doing to the people in Trinidad, in Jamaica, and Philippines that are forcing people to migrate? So what is the relationship through trade agreements, through colonialism, that has created this unequal exchange, both economic, political, social, but also racial, and forcing people to come multi-generational? It's not just simply saying that people are coming here to improve themselves, which is true. But what are these larger structural factors that have great-grandfathers, grandfathers, fathers, and sons now tied to the same employers or the same industry here in Canada? So with that, I just want us to start thinking about the racial reckoning that exists in our own backyard. We do not need to look to the United States. We do not need to look to the United Kingdom. What is happening in Canada currently is not necessarily a shame or a disaster. This is an issue that all of us, if we do fight together, can change. So no one is disregarded. No one is dehumanized. No one faces the conditions of racism and oppression in our own communities and our own backyards. And I definitely invite all of us to work together towards some form of solidarity to end the oppression and the exploitation that happens in the fields across Canada. Thank you.